Hello and welcome to Principles of Micro with James Bland. Today I'm going to be teaching you about subsidizing a positive externality. So in the previous class I showed you that we could, the government could correct a negative externality by taxing the market by the value of the external cost, right? And so this essentially made sellers internalize the external cost of the externality, so sellers are paying attention to this additional cost that the trade is imposing on a third party. And so this is going to look almost exactly the same as that diagram, except now instead of the government taxing a market, they're going to subsidize a market, because when we have a positive externality, people don't do enough of it in the situation where they are just responding to their private incentives. So let's have a think about this from the perspective of from a market. Okay, so here's my supply and demand diagram, and I'm going to sort of the opposite of my previous class, I'm going to keep the supply curve here. I'm going to keep the supply curve constant. Remember, this is going to be equal to private marginal cost, and because we have no negative externality here, this is also equal to social marginal cost. So in this situation, sellers are paying attention to the right marginal cost, right? The seller's marginal costs are the marginal cost to society, because trades in this market, maybe we're thinking about flu shots or something like that, producing a flu shot isn't imposing a cost on anyone else, okay? But now we have a demand curve here. Okay, here's our demand curve, which is always going to be equal to our private marginal value, but here it's not equal to our social marginal value. And then on top of this, we have a positive externality. Okay, so here we're going to have that the social marginal value is above the private marginal value, right? So here we have, here is the externality, a positive externality. Okay, so to begin with, let's label on our diagram what happens in equilibrium if the government does not intervene. So here we have our quantity and our equilibrium price. But as I showed you in the initial positive externality video, the optimal quantity of trade here is over here. We need this quantity to be produced, right? In the context of flu shots, if we just left people up to their own, just to follow their own private incentives, not enough people would get flu shots. And the reason in the model for this is that at the equilibrium quantity, we have social marginal cost is less than social marginal value, and so we'd do better by producing more. And so at this point here, where the social marginal value curve intersects with the social marginal cost curve, this is the quantity where we maximize total surplus, right? So this is where social marginal cost equals social marginal value. Okay, and so just like the situation we had with externality or with negative externalities, what we need to do here is to ask, how can the government make the demand curve look like the social marginal value curve? Okay, so looking at this graph, the demand curve is too low relative to the social marginal value curve. Okay, so think about this as, the government needs to increase the height of the demand curve Okay. And you can think about this as the government adding value to consumers' private values to this. And, this is called a subsidy. Basically, the government is going to pay consumers, and I mean, going back to, I think, chapter 6 of ManQ, it doesn't really matter whether the government subsidizes the supply or the demand side. It's going to add value to consumers for consuming this good. Not only do they get the private value of consuming this flu shot, but the government also gives them some money to do it, right? So if you think about it, if I value something at $10, but then the government gives me another $2 just for buying the thing, then I value it at $12, right? Because it comes with cash that I can use to do something else with. Okay. Alternatively, I'm going to act as if the price is $2 less than it actually is. Okay. So, essentially, what the government needs to do is to pin down a price consumers pay such that they choose Q star. So the price consumers pay needs to be somewhere on the demand curve and intersects with this vertical line at Q star. So that's going to be over here. All right, this is the price consumers pay. And then we need sellers to produce this quantity, so we need the price sellers receive to be up here. Okay. And so the way the government's going to be able to do that, the way the government's going to have to achieve that is they're going to have to subsidize the market by this much, right? The height here is the subsidy. And so if you're thinking this diagram looks like a tax, it's because you're right. It's just that this is a negative tax. Remember, in this situation, the price sellers receive is above the price consumers pay, whereas with the tax, it's the other way around. Okay, so let's think about total surplus before the tax and after the tax. Okay, so in general, total surplus is going to be equal to the area between social marginal value, right? So we're adding up private marginal value and external marginal value, and social marginal cost, which in this case is just private marginal cost, right? Because we don't have a negative externality in this market. You can always add these things in, but we're just making things more complicated without adding any more, learning to this. Okay, so let's have a look at total surplus before the tax. Okay, so before the tax, we're producing the equilibrium quantity. Okay, and so here is the social marginal value curve up to the equilibrium quantity, and here is the social marginal cost curve up to the equilibrium quantity. And so the total value generated from these trades is equal to this yellow area here. Okay, and as an exercise, you should probably have a think about which parts of this area are consumer surplus, producer surplus, and external benefit. Okay. Now, so we've got this area here, this one here, which is our total surplus before the subsidy. Okay, and now we're going to think about what happens after the subsidy. Well, I need a different color for this. After the subsidy, Q star is being produced. Okay, so now we need the area between the after the subsidy here, we need the area between the, well, again, the social marginal cost curve, so that's this bit here, and the social marginal value curve, which is here. But now we go all the way up to Q star. Okay, so here we're getting all of the yellow area plus a little bit more. Okay, remember, we're including the little bit more is this bit here. Okay, the bit that I'm shading in to the best of my ability in its entirety. Okay, so after the subsidy, we're getting this, which is a larger area than the yellow area. Oops, sorry, wrong way. That way. Okay, so total surplus increases if the government subsidizes the market. Okay, now this doesn't come at a cost to the government. The government's now paying people to buy the good. Okay, they're paying people some money to buy the good. And so now the government is going to have to pay the value of the subsidy for every item that's sold, right? So the government is paying this much here, right? This is the cost of the subsidy. I'm gonna not waste too much time coloring this in. Okay, so this area is the cost of the subsidy. Okay, so the government in this case may have to spend a lot of money to subsidize the market to this extent, or not a lot of money, just depending on, you know, how big the size of the externality is, and it kind of depends on the, well, it depends not only on the size of the externality, but also on the optimal quantity, right? The government needs to pay the subsidy per item that's the value of the externality, right? They need to subsidize the market by the difference between the private marginal value and the social marginal value curves, right? And they need to pay that for every item that's sold in the market. Okay, so that in itself could be a lot of money or not a lot of money, depending on what this height is, but also what this quantity is. Okay. Now, it might be that the government is subsidizing the market by more than it might be that the government is subsidizing the market by more than the amount that total surplus goes up. Or it could be that the government is subsidizing the market by less than the amount total surplus goes up. And it doesn't really matter which, as long as total surplus is going up, this is welfare improving. You remember, there are a lot of situations where the government will subsidize, but there are a lot of situations that make sense to run public goods, which we'll get to in the next chapter, at a loss because they're welfare improving. It's just privately not optimal for them to be produced. For example, public libraries. Okay, no government sets out to set up a system of public libraries with the intention of it making a profit or anything. You know, that's explicitly run at a loss, right? A loss to the government, but it generates a really big public good. And so, you know, the importance of subsidizing externalities, or positive externalities, isn't for the government to try and improve surplus by more than the amount they spend. The goal is to achieve this optimal quantity. Okay, so thank you very much. I'm James Bland, and I'll see you later.